Well, thanks to our regular correspondent Rebecca Barnett, we've been introduced to the work of Ursula Edgington from New Zealand. She's the one who first uncovered or first brought to our attention the fact that there had been some exemptions provided by the New Zealand government for some of their workers, preferred workers perhaps, but there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and in fact, frankly, impossible to know information around this. So what we decided to do was to bring Ursula Edgington on herself so that we can try and wrap our heads around what do we know, what don't we know, and what's it like trying to get information out of the New Zealand government? Ursula, welcome so much to the. Thank you so much for coming on to the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher. Thanks for inviting me on.
So
Yeah,
it was initially it was your work trying to extract information from the New Zealand government to understand the truth of what's really happened with these vaccine exemptions. Can you bring us up to date with what you've learnt so far, not only about the exemptions but also about how hard they're working not to tell you about it?
yeah. So just to backtrack a little bit, the OIA, the Official Information Act request that I put in was actually some time ago at the end of the vaccine mandates, vaccine in inverted commas mandates
Mm.
for the healthcare workers here, which was about this time last year. And somebody more recently published an OIA on their Substack, NZ that presented some data which didn't really tally with the OIA response that I had got, but I hadn't published at that time. So I went back to the original OIA, tried to make sense of it. And yeah, I mean, the interpretation or misinterpretation of the OIA questions that we pose
Mm.
is central to this. A single word in a sentence can prevent the correct response from being from coming from New Zealand government, or it can just mean that they just don't respond at all. So
Mm.
it's very much a case, in my experience with OIAs, in the 10 years that I've been in New Zealand, I have sent quite a lot. In fact, all the authorities probably think, oh God, not this woman again. But, you have to just keep persisting.
Mm.
It is a case of drilling down. You get one general answer, and then that will present more questions. And then you'll go on, drill further and further down to what you hope is the valuable information that they probably don't want you to get to.
So what do you believe
So
you've actually been able to learn so far? What can we say with any degree of confidence out of this?
we can say with a degree of confidence that there was an enormous amount of secrecy surrounding the vaccine exemptions that were granted under what they called the significant service disruption category. So there was basically two categories of people in terms of applications to their employer that would allow them to not be vaccinated and still carry on with their work
Mm.
in the various sectors. And you'll know from your experience in Australia, Topher, that different sectors had different vaccine mandates applied at different times. So that
Sure.
sort of, confuses the issue even more in some ways. But certainly in terms of the healthcare sector, there was up to 11,000 people that we know of who were granted these vaccine exemptions. A lot of them were in, administration stroke senior positions, but there were also a lot of doctors and nurses. It would be fascinating to know whether those doctors and nurses actually administered the injections themselves whilst being exempted. The ethics around that and the informed consent that was missing is pretty shocking, to be honest.
So I want to try and be fairly precise about what we do and what we don't know. In terms of the number of exemptions that were granted, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, these were exemptions granted by category. It's not as though they had 11,000 individuals apply for exemptions and have them granted or anything like that. They were granted to entire
Yeah,
categories of people. Do we have any idea how many people actually exercised the exemption as opposed to had it but may or may not have exercised it?
yeah, that's a really good question, and that again is something that we don't really have any clear
Right.
information of. Um, in spite of repeated requests to the various, authorities.
Mm.
So there were definitely application forms for individuals, and
Okay.
I've got copies of those.
Okay.
There were also applications that were done on a general basis for large industries, commercial industries that, like Fonterra, for instance, which had close partnerships with government And you know how it works. It's not what you know, it's who you know.
Sure.
And so they were in positions of power to say, we can't carry on our, in our industry without these exemptions for our integral members of senior staff, probably. And that ticked the box in terms of their exemptions. But yeah, drilling down into the details of exactly how many people we're not sure at the moment. As I say, the approximate figure is 11,000. I think the breakdown by area, what we call the old DHBs, the district health boards, which have now, I mean, that's another example of how they've obfuscated the data. Because actually the district health boards have been amalgamated into a central healthcare system, a bit like they've done in other countries. So, sorry.
That's all right.
The So that's a way of.
So Ursula, it
Sorry.
strikes me, firstly, obviously, you're having to work incredibly hard to try and uncover this information, but also it strikes me we're not seeing this level of curiosity or determination or investigation from New Zealand media, from New Zealand academia. No one else seems to be trying to get to the bottom of really much when it comes to COVID. There's an astonishing level of incuriosity, and certainly in Australia. It appears to me in New Zealand as well. What do you put that down to?
Oh, yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, there's obviously lots of people in positions of power who recognise that what they did was wrong, ethically wrong, wrong, anti-science, etc. The corporate playbook really is a part of them doubling down
Sure.
on their mistakes. They can't accept that they made a mistake because that would open them up to all kinds of criticism and litigation, etc. There is obviously some people who are, waving flags. I mean, Winston Churchill, Winston at New Zealand First,
Winston Peters.
Winston Peters.
Yeah.
He has been vocal
Sure.
in calling for a COVID inquiry. I've not checked this morning, but I presume they still haven't finalised the coalition government. It's still ongoing in their negotiations, and that will be a big sticking point because Luxon and the others in Parliament are pretty much stuck in that cognitive dissonance space where they don't want to even accept what went on. They just want to carry on regardless. So, yeah, it will be very interesting to see how the next few months develop in terms of an awareness of what's happening. Of course, in the background, we've got these excess all-cause mortality stacking up, and the healthcare system here. I mean, the hospitals. I don't know, what they're like where you are, Topher, but certainly the hospitals here, there's horrendous waiting lists, even to get into emergency. It's hours of waiting and short-staffed and just, awful, really, situation.
Yeah, it's certainly not a good time to get sick in Australia. I can tell you that much. Now, you've had some fairly unkind things to say about academia in New Zealand, and in particular, and we'll put a link to this Substack of yours into the comments section under this video so that people can find it. You're alleging, and I've just got it here. Orwellian Health New Zealand claims evidence. No, excuse me, that's the wrong one. I've got multiple of your Substack. I recommend people go and read Ursula's Substack. It's actually really good. New Zealand, this is the correct one. New Zealand universities spent millions silencing academics during COVID era. That's a hell of an allegation. What have you uncovered?
Yes, well, many of my colleagues in academia have experienced the various ways that the corporate playbook can silence uncomfortable truths, as it's known. And yeah, my suspicions about how the various academics that undoubtedly were speaking out, like you and I, about the lockdowns, etc., and later the mandates. There was definitely a specific strategy of silencing those dissenting voices. And one of those strategies would inevitably lead to those people being bullied out of their institutions. And so one way of investigating what that actually looks like is how many non-disclosure agreements, gagging clauses, have been issued by the various universities in New
Sure.
Zealand over the last few years. So it didn't give me what I hoped for, but it did give me some indication that there was definitely an increase in those NDAs from all the universities, or most of them, some more than others, over the COVID mandate period, which would indicate that, you know, there were people that felt for whatever reason they couldn't carry on in their role.
Yeah. They were leaving and then being gagged. Presumably, their package on their way out the door would have been contingent on them signing some paperwork. That's usually how these sorts of things go.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's across the board. I mean, I don't know whether you listen to Cheryl Atkinson, the award-winning journalist who's, you know, standing up for free speech in the media, but you know, that's one of the things she speaks about, and has written about extensively, the ways that journalists with you know, trying to expose meaningful, you know, uncomfortable information about what's going on, if it doesn't fit the narrative, or if it's hurtful to a, you know, a profitable company, that article won't be published. And if the journalist keeps insisting on trying to follow that pathway, then they get, you know, there's all kinds of legalities involved in terms of surveillance techniques and bullying them out. And it often ends in an NDA, so that they get a compensation package and walk away without. I mean, it's just ridiculous that you know, the levels that these corporates will go to make sure that there's nothing that's allowed to be said against them, and that's how the PR machinery works. You know, lots of people aren't aware of what goes on in the background of some of these companies.
Well, I just finished rereading 1984, and just to refresh it in my memory, and it's all sounding a little bit too eerily, uncomfortably close to the fiction that I just finished reading. Ursula, thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.